Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second in a series of workshops and webinars put on by the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences in the area of artificial intelligence, or AI. Today, I'm pleased to introduce two speakers who will be with us today, and the meeting will be led by Chris McCarty. What I would like to do is take a moment and just tell you a little bit about the topic, and specifically the exploding impact of natural language processing in the economy. So businesses built on NLP, as it's called, have seen enormous gains in revenues across the world over the last several years. So you can see that the growth has been very rapid over 5 years, and the expected growth over the next 5 years is exponential. So for that reason, we thought it would be useful to do a workshop today on NLP. And I'd like to begin by introducing our host, Chris McCarty. Chris?
Thanks, Dave. So I'm Chris McCarty. I'm an associate dean in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. So I have two jobs. The first one is to introduce the speakers and contributors, and the second is to moderate the questions and answers. So as the talk's going on, if you have any questions, if you wouldn't mind typing them into that Q&A box that comes up when you click the button at the bottom. And then at the end, when they're done, I'll try and present the questions to them. So there's two speakers today. The talk's divided roughly into two parts. The first speaker will be Kevin Tang, who is a relatively new assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics. He was a hire in the area of computational linguistics. He's done natural language processing, often with languages that most of us don't speak. And then the other is Raffaele Vacca, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology. Raffaele and I have been working together for several years on a Clinical and Translational Science Institute-funded network science project. You'll see a little bit of that as an example towards the end. I also want to point to Krenz, who is a postdoc who's been with us for a couple of years working on the network science project. And then Tom Smith is a graduate student in sociology, soon to become a postdoc for our project. Both Till and Tom have done an awful lot in advancing the topic modeling that you'll hear today. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. I think Raffaele will run the slides, so Kevin is going to ask Raffaele to move the slides.
Thank you, Chris, for the gracious introduction. Next, please. So before we start, I want to basically point out the NLP landscape at CLAS. So to do that, we did a little survey. We asked the audience, the attendants, what experience they have had with NLP. And the majority of you actually have very limited or zero experience. And that's good because we're hoping to change that. And secondly, we also asked and found out that a majority of you do both qualitative and quantitative research. And that's important because the kind of pre-processing or methodology from NLP might be different depending on what kind of research you do. And finally, we asked what kind of data set you guys primarily work on. And most of you said you work on text. So this workshop is going to be primarily focused on text processing. Next. So today's agenda is a few folds. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about how we can use natural language processing as a kind of AI enhanced annotation tool. And then we'll move away from that and talk about how we can understand a piece of text or even infer the attitude and the mental state of the speaker or writers when they are producing those language data. And after this, we're going to, my colleague Raffaele is going to show us how we can connect these extracted dimensions and meanings and themes behind a piece of text and relate them to tell us something about document similarity or author similarity and conduct different classification tasks. And fourthly, he's going to tell you a few different case studies, different research examples that demonstrates all three components: annotation, extraction of themes and meaning, and relationships. And finally, we have a few kind of pre-planned FAQ questions that hopefully will be quite useful to discuss. Next. So natural language processing. So first we have to understand what natural language is about. And natural language, for those who are not familiar, is actually a fairly complex system. There are multiple levels and modules. From a very low level, we have phonetics and phonology, namely how we produce and perceive speech sounds, as well as the grammar that drives the sound sequences. So you can't just have any old sound followed by any old sound. There's a system behind it. And at the next level, we're talking about morphology, the meaningful components of words. So if you take as very simple words in English, like disrespectful, then you have respect, you have this as a prefix, full as a suffix. These are meaningful components. So it basically is the grammar that tie these components together. Languages like Turkish, for example, have very complex morphological system, and English might be slightly simpler. And the next level is about the structural relationship between words. So again, you kind of have word salad. Not any word can follow by any word. There is an underlying structure that drives why certain structure is plausible and what is not plausible. And once we understand the structure, we need to be able to interpret meanings from them, right? So we need to be able to understand the meaning behind words and indeed behind sentences. And the final level is discourse. Essentially, is any analysis that deals with larger linguistic units than a single sentence. Next. So that's natural language done. What about processing? Well, the way I see it is that we need to basically build computer systems that can deal with and process natural language. So on a very basic level, for the very top, you can use NLP as a way to process a massive amount of language data. That could be billions of written words, 1,000 hours of audio recording, and conduct specific kind of annotation. So that could be adding timestamps to your audio files. Or if you have languages like Chinese or Turkish or Korean and so on, you can chop it up into smaller pieces, right? Especially when languages don't use white spaces to denote words. And with languages that are complex, you want to divide it into submorphemes. And the second level is basically talking about how we can understand that piece of text. What's that piece of text about? What is the mental state of the speaker when they are producing those texts? What do they want to convey? What's their attitude? And so today's talk, we're going to focus mostly on the first two components, but there are other levels as well, such as human-computer interactions. So when you use your Siri or Alexa asking for the weather, you're essentially dealing with a system that understands some aspect of natural language and to be able to give you a response. And finally, perhaps the holy grail of this field is to be able to have a system that behaves very much like a competent human speaker. And that's a hard thing to do. So that taps into areas called natural language understanding, whether they can understand high-level concepts as we would do, and to be able to generate responses that are actually human-like. Next. So what natural language processing is that it is a subfield of natural language, linguistics, and it combines it with tools and methods and techniques from computer science and AI. And I see there are basically two primary goals. There's a knowledge-based driven kind of goal, namely how can we understand the scientific study of language from a computational perspective. On the other hand, there's a kind of more application or engineering driven goal. So that would be like be able to train the system to automate language processing, understanding, build a device like Siri, computer-human interactions. And NLP is not, I'd like to emphasize, not here to replace humans. We are actually extraordinarily better at many tasks. Let's take speech recognition, for example. If you talk to your Siri or Alexa, let's say if you deviate in terms of the way you speak, let's say you speak with a different accent that was not trained by the system, or you speak in a noisy environment, or there are multiple people talking in the background, all these issues will be very problematic for a machine, but for humans, we can very easily deal with those problems. And these systems tend to be very good at doing specific tasks, but they lack a general learning or understanding. Unlike us, we can do speech recognition, object recognition, we can do everything simultaneously rather than having very specific specialized components. And these systems are only really as good as us, as good as our humans, engineers, or humans input data. And so I argue that it really can help us to become superhumans. It can help us rapidly replicate and speed up any monotonous tasks by learning from our inputs. And it can also reveal any kind of hidden patterns that are simply too complex, too multidimensional for our human mind to comprehend. Next. And so very firstly, I'd like to talk about how natural language processing serves as an annotation tool and how it can facilitate us with both qualitative and quantitative approaches in research. So in most of the stuff that we do as researchers, most of the time we collect and analyze some data, and based on those, we would construct hypotheses and theories. And that is not unlike in, for example, in social sciences, there's a grounded theory or approaches in digital humanities. And these areas all can benefit or even rely on natural language processing. And I also see NLP as a way for us to enhance human analysis. So there might be softwares that you have used already called MaxQDA and Vivo. These are computer-assisted softwares. And I would say the NLP is highly compatible with these systems. And my colleague Raffaele is going to touch on that later on in depth. And finally, let's say you do have some manual coding of data using these softwares if you want. And you can use them as training data, and you can train your machine by applying machine learning techniques to learn and apply the underlying decision process that the human annotator makes and apply them to new data that has not gone through manual annotation, i.e. replicate human annotation and some basic understanding. Next. So I used the kind of term machine learning. So what is it? So first we have to understand what learning is. So learning on some level is basically that there are some observations, and based on these observations, you might want to extract some knowledge will get extrapolated or extracted. And you will use this knowledge to be able to make predictions on future observations. So that's kind of basically like learning. But for the machine, we can see it as the study of algorithms that is there to improve the certain level of performance at some specific tasks trained on the experience or the observations that were made and given to the system. And this kind of understanding that we can get from the system comes with kind of a philosophical question. What is a true understanding, right? Do we use the Turing test and so on? I won't touch on those areas, but I just want to be you guys to be mindful about what is actually learned by the machine. And thirdly, there are, broadly speaking, two types of learning. You can have supervised machine learning, namely the learning would simply stop when the algorithm achieves a certain acceptable level of performance. So that level of performance could be how we would perform in the same task, right? So the machine would be as good as humans, for example. And unsupervised learning basically is a kind of learning with no correct answer. You kind of create some kind of learning objective and some kind of you give it the data and you ask it to basically explore and model some underlying structure that is in the data itself. Next. So very quickly then, we can basically represent each observation as a pair of values, x and y. And x can be a property of the observation, a set of properties of the observation, and y is the observation itself. And once we have those data, we can extrapolate some mathematical function from the observation. And with that function, now we can take new observation, look at the properties, and be able to predict a specific estimate for given for y value. So for those who did high school mathematics will know that when you get a plot like x versus x by y, and you ask you to draw a line of best fit, what you've effectively done is you have established the relationship between two variables, right? Between y and x. And the line that you drew is the relationship itself. That's your model. Next. All right, so I talk about like having a set of properties for observation. So then what do I really mean by that? Well, here I have an example of trying to teach a machine to recognize cats versus dogs versus birds. And so we have lots of images of animals. And so some properties of these images or informative properties would be things like the length of the whiskers of the cat, the length of its tail, the shape of their ears, and so on. And so these are informative properties that can potentially tell us whether this image is a cat or a dog, and so on. But we need to also learn the weight, the relative importance of these features. And having learned that from the data, we can now take a new novel image, like on the top right, with this cat. We don't know what is it. I don't know what animal it is, but I can measure the length of its whiskers, the length of its tails, and so on. And given the weight, I can estimate the probability of this image being a cat. Next. So when I say about these informative features, I really mean that these are features that should be supplied by the human researchers. So we should decide what are important, what potentially serve as important features. Here I would like to illustrate how if the researchers were not mindful of the feature selection, if they just pick any old features, then it could really lead to a bad model and also fail to learn the underlying representation. If we look on the right of this image, Raffaele, can you show us the right of the, everything, okay, stop. So on the right here, we see a spiral shape. And so this data set has an interesting spiral structure, but because of bad feature selection, the model failed to find the underlying spiral shape, and it's trying its best to fit the spiral shape, but it fails. Next. So I'd like to end part one with a simple case study. So which is basically what I do a lot of the times, because I deal with both human speech data and text data. So much of what I do is I want to be able to have an acoustic file, an audio file that is being manually transcribed, but I want to be able to identify which portion of the file corresponds to which portion of the text file. So which, from time point t to t plus whatever, this corresponds to sentence 1, and so on. And there's a technique to do that. It's called forced alignment. And essentially what I would do is I will feed in the acoustic data, the speech data, and convert it into some vector representation, some informative features, and combine that with the transcription and try to be able to predict the time points of that audio file. And this specific case study is not without its problems, right, this approach, because this kind of model are highly language specific. And also there are errors that can creep in from the training data itself. The audio might contain overlapping speech, right? Then it wouldn't work that well. And also if the transcribers themselves fail to transcribe all the details like ums and ahs, that they are basically not being faithful, then it can also throw the algorithm off. Next, please. So that's basically how we can use natural language processing to do annotation work. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can understand the meaning behind a piece of text and the writers. First topic I would like to talk about is how we can summarize the content and extract topics and meanings from text. Then after that, I would talk a little bit about how we can also understand the sentiment or attitude behind a piece of text. Next. So when we talk about quantifying meaning behind a piece of text, we need to first understand meaning behind a word. And you might say, oh, Kevin, I know this. I know how to use a dictionary. I go to my Oxford English Dictionary, flip to the page of the word pepper. I know exactly what it is. Yes and no. If you were to do that, you'll find very quickly that there are multiple sub-senses when it comes to a simple word like pepper. It can be used as the spice that you use in cooking and eating. It can also be used to refer to a plant, right? The Californian pepper tree. And these different senses really would come up in the right context, right? So if you're talking about cooking in the kitchen, you'll be referring to pepper in the sense of the spice. But if you're in a botanical garden, you're talking more likely about the Californian pepper plant. So this is to illustrate that meaning really vary in terms of the context and space. And meaning can also vary across time. So let's take the simple word like terrific. Terrific back in the day has a very negative sentiment. It really has like a sentiment like terrible or terrifying even. But in most recent years, terrific takes on a very rather positive meaning. So you could say, oh, this talk is really terrific. Next. So continuing on how different context would give you different senses, essentially that's how we can rely on, that's what we can rely on in order to quantify meaning. So let's take another example of the word like geek and nerd. So on the first glance, you would say, oh, these two words are basically the same, right? They're basically synonymous to each other. They are referring to the same thing. But if you were to actually dig deeper in the data and observe how these words are used, or what words these words tend to co-occur with, you will see some pattern emerging. So on the plot on the right, you will see that basically a bunch of words that co-occur more with nerd than with geek, and vice versa for the yellow words. So you see that words like bookcase or no, bookworms, library, reading, these physics, mathematics, this word co-occur much more likely with nerd than with geek. And with geeks, we get words like techie or maybe cosplay, Comic-Con, and Star Wars, and so on. So that's really reinforces our stereotype that you get a computer geek and a science or book nerd. Next. Alrighty, so how do we then represent that intuition that we have into some kind of numerical representation? Well, let's take a few sample words like apricot and pineapple, digital and information. And we simply count how many times all the other words in the language will co-occur with these four words, let's say. And we would just count it all the way in the x-axis. So there's infinite number of, not infinite, there's an entire vocab across the x-axis. And we'll see that words like apricot and pineapple would co-occur 0 times with aardvark, 0 times with computer, but they do co-occur similarly frequent with pinch and with sugar and perhaps with other cooking terms. And with digital and information, we see that these two words co-occur with a different set of words like computer and data and result, but not with sugar and aardvark. And now we basically have a mathematical or numerical representation for a word's meaning. Because if we were to compare these sequences of numbers, we'll find that apricot and pineapple have very similar set of numbers, i.e. they share very similar context, and intuitively they also share a similar meaning. And we can visualize that on the right in a two-dimensional space. We'll see that words like cats and dogs cluster together because they share similar context, whereas words up to the top like demon and devil and paradise, these words cluster amongst themselves more, illustrating that similar context can give us, reflects our intuition that words also share similar meanings. Next. So now we have a way to quantify the meaning behind a word and even measure meanings between words. And we'd like to kind of extend that into looking at how we can understand and quantify the topic or theme behind a piece of text. And this also relies on how words co-occurs in a piece of text. And we're using a kind of unsupervised machine learning method, which, as I said already, relies on no correct answers, and it also the underlying structure. So by measuring how words co-occur in many pieces of text and documents, we can now basically find a latent representation, a latent space that can capture the underlying topics and themes. And my colleague later have a lovely illustration that will show what that means. But for now, for those who knows a statistical method called principal component analysis, basically one type of topic modeling, which is called latent semantic analysis, shares the underlying mathematics. Next. And so under this framework called topic modeling, then a topic is represented as a probability distribution over words. Click next. And on the right here, we see a number of topics as a result of a topic modeling. And we see that topic 1 has the number of keywords. So these keywords are words have very high probability for that topic. So words for topic 1 that keyword were eat, rice, soup, beans, look, food. And words, let's say for topic 6, the keywords are priest, church, God, father, saint. So very quickly, we can see that topic 1 is referring to some kind of a food topic, and topic 6 is referring to some kind of a religion topic. And if we look at this slightly differently now, looking in terms of documents, each document can now be represented as a probability distribution over topics. So for a specific document, you needn't talk only just about food. You can talk about 20% food, 40% religion, 20%, 10% politics, and so on. So now we can basically effectively represent both topics as a distribution of words and documents as a distribution of topics. Next. So now we have been able to quantify a word's meaning and even the meaning or theme behind a piece of text. Now I'd like to kind of look at it slightly differently. Now I'd like to look at the sentiment, the attitude behind a piece of text. There are different dimensions one could look at. You can look at dimensions like love, anger, hate, and we can kind of simplify them as kind of weighted polarity or on some kind of a scale. Is it positive, negative, or neutral? The way to do it, the most simple way is we need to find a way to quantify the sentiment level of these different dimensions for every single word. And we would simply take a piece of text or a sentence and do some kind of a weighted average. So to illustrate that, I have two tweets. The tweet on the left, well, both of them are talking about coronavirus. The tweet on the left says, official counts understate the US coronavirus death toll. And words like death toll are very, very negative, right? And so on average, you would basically get a negative sentiment value for that sentence. So that's a negative tweet. On the right, we have the sentence, the coronavirus has been translated into music and is surprisingly beautiful. So words like music and beautiful of positive sentiments. And so if you do some kind of weighted average again, you'll basically say that, oh yeah, this piece of text is rather positive, despite the fact it talks about coronavirus. Next. So what can we use these sentiment analysis for, right? You can do a lot with it. You can, for example, if you have lots of reviews of certain things, you can use it to gauge what do people think about the new iPhone. Or if you have teaching reviews, you can see what students think about a specific professor, right? Or if you look at Twitters and you can see, oh, these tweets are all talking about this specific, this new company, and you can gauge the public sentiment. What do people think about this company? Are they confident with this company? Are they confident with the stock market? Or you can, are they confident with this particular political candidate? And so on. Next. Now I'd like to pass the baton to my colleague Raffaele, who's going to tell you a little bit about how we can use these different dimensions of meanings and themes that we extracted or sentiment and conduct relationship and classification analyses. Thank you, Raffaele.
Kevin. Yeah, so after annotation, annotating text and extracting meaning and themes, the third broad goal that we typically have in a natural language processing project is to find and examine relationships between documents and really between any entity that is represented as a document in our study and classifying these documents and entities. And there are at least 4 ways that we can do this in an NLP project. We can use clustering, which is really essentially what many of you are probably already familiar with coming from multivariate statistics and cluster analysis. We can use topic models, which Kevin briefly discussed earlier in the presentation, and I'm going to say a few words about in a couple of minutes. We can use networks and combine network analysis with natural language processing results, or we can use vector spaces, which is what Kevin mentioned before. Essentially is about converting words and documents into numeric vectors, which can then be projected into a single vector space, precisely highlighting proximities and distances between documents or words. Before giving you a little bit more detail about topic models and networks and how they can be used to find relationships and classifications, I thought it would be helpful to have a look at what type of data and data sources really we're talking about here. Kevin presented a couple of examples from linguistics, for example, conversations, speech. He showed a couple of tweets. He showed, I believe, an Amazon review, or anyway, a review from probably web commerce, internet commerce website. So these can really be many type of text data, interviews, conversations, newspaper articles, A screenplay is a document. A book, obviously, is a document. An Instagram post, a tweet, a scientific abstract from an article, a YouTube video can be transcribed and analyzed as a document in this context. Song lyrics, Amazon reviews. Keep in mind that for many of these types of data, today we have large digital archives or databases available that we can use to download large amounts of these data, such as Nexis Uni for newspaper articles or TV news, Google Books, Web of Science, obviously, for scientific articles. So a document may be any of these things, but in an even more flexible way, and this often, I would say always comes up in a real research project, we may decide to aggregate text at different levels so that our documents represent other types of entities that we're interested in. For example, if we're interested really in relationships between scientists, we may aggregate all these scientific abstracts that have been authored or co-authored by one scientist in 1 year, and now our document is really a scientist. A document may then be an author, a speaker, a Twitter user, an ethnographic informant for our colleagues in anthropology or sociology, a politician if we concatenate or aggregate, for example, all the tweets sent out by one politician in a given year, or even higher levels, a company, an NGO, even a country. If, for example, we're analyzing policy documents and we aggregate together all the policy documents coming from a country or from a government. How do we use topic models and networks in particular in natural language processing? You have two visualizations here on the right. With topic models, what we do is we discover a limited number of semantically cohesive topics indicated as K in the visualization here within a typically large collection of documents D. Remember that a topic in this context, like Kevin explained, is essentially a set of words with probabilities attached to these words, probabilities that indicate the extent to which that word is associated to or defines that topic. And a document symmetrically is seen in this context as a mixture, as a combination of topics with a probability attached to each topic, indicating the degree to which that topic appears or is contained in that document. With network analysis, we can then identify links between words or documents based, for example, on co-occurrence. A link may indicate the extent to which two words tend to appear together, co-occur in the same documents, or topic similarity between documents. The link may indicate the degree to which two documents tend to share the same topics. So our main goals here are to extract major recurrent topics in a large corpus of text, to measure the association between each topic and each document, or to measure the association or similarity between two different topics based on the extent to which they appear in the same documents, or between two different documents based on the extent to which they share the same topics. And with network analysis, describe positions, distances, or clusters, identify clusters of words or documents within a larger network structure. And we're going to conclude this presentation by showing you a couple of examples from real-world research projects in which we used some of these NLP methods. The first project has to do with sustainable development, science, and policies. We were interested here in particular in analyzing the language around the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. These are 17 goals that the UN General Assembly established in 2015 as part of its Sustainable Development Agenda to promote sustainable development in many different areas, from economic growth to environmental sustainability, global health, peace, and so on. Now, these 17 SDGs are articulated into sub-goals and targets, 169 of them. So you may imagine here that the result is a large set of goals and sub-goals, which at the same time address a large variety of areas of human and social development, but are interconnected and have a number of important interdependencies and overlaps. And this is exactly what we want to look at with natural language processing. The data that we use in this project come from the web. The United Nations maintain an official website about the Sustainable Development Agenda and the SDGs. For each SDG, this website has text that describes that SDG according to the UN and describes that SDG's targets and indicators. And for every year in the past 5 or 6 years, if I remember correctly, we have text describing the global progress that was made on that SDG. So we can use web scraping software to automatically download and clean this large body of text, which essentially represents official international policy discourse around sustainable development and the SDGs. In this context, a document to us is one SDG. In this project, which was conducted in collaboration with the One Health Center of Excellence here at the University of Florida in IFAS and the University of Florida Clinical and Translational Science Institute in the College of Medicine, we used NLP in all 3 of the areas that were mentioned today: annotation, meanings and themes, relationships, and classifications. For example, we annotated text to distill only the text that was relevant for subsequent analysis, for example, by removing stop words like and, to, the, which are obviously not of interest in our analysis. We extract meanings and notions of sustainable development according to the UN, and we extract the main topics and terms that define each SDG, but also we are interested in how SDGs are related to each other, how they're interconnected, how they are interdependent. We ran some of the analysis that Kevin mentioned earlier today, including LSA, LDA, word-to-vec, and the result here is a number of measures of similarity between SDGs or proximity between SDGs and topics extracted from the text describing these SDGs. Similarities and topics are then used to identify clusters of related SDGs and their targets. You can see some of the relationships between SDGs and clusters of SDGs that we discovered in these 2 visualizations in the slide. Each cluster of SDGs has one or multiple topics attached to it. And this means that we can interpret meaningfully that cluster, but it also means that that cluster can be jointly addressed by the same type of policies or scientific expertise. So in this project, NLP confirmed some well-known overlaps between SDGs. For example, the obvious interconnection between SDG 1, no poverty, and SDG 8, economic growth. But it also discovered new, subtler overlaps, such as between SDG 3, gender equality, and SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. So it unveiled new interdependencies and interconnections between policy goals and sustainable development areas, which are not as easily visible, not as obvious, not necessarily expected based on theoretical models of what sustainable development is, models such as those that you see in the 2 figures in this slide. And it also identifies, again, areas of scientific expertise that is relevant simultaneously to a whole cluster of multiple SDGs. The second project that I'm going to quickly talk about has to do with scientific collaboration and team science. There is obviously a growing recognition that scientific collaboration is essential to address a number of crucial scientific and societal challenges, climate change, COVID-19, obviously, and this includes collaboration between different disciplines and between institutions, for example, between different universities. A riskier type of collaboration in this case, which is rarely the result of spontaneous behaviors of scientists and is rarely produced by the natural evolution of a scientific network. That's why we may need interventions to promote or facilitate this type of interdisciplinary or cross-institution collaboration. At the same time, research administrators or research policymakers, think of the University of Florida as an example, may want to promote research on specific topics, for example, AI, or with specific goals, or between particular institutions, for example, between the University of Florida and Florida State University. This particular project aimed to come up with an intervention to promote scientific collaboration between the University of Florida and Florida State University in a particular field, in clinical and translational science. These two networks in the slide show the actual behavioral collaborations that take place between scientists at two different universities. On the left, the two colors are two different universities. Each dot is a scientist. Two scientists are linked if they work together. Obviously, we have, as expected, a divide, a separation between the two universities. But if we use NLP to produce the network on the right, to identify topical relationships, topical overlaps between the areas of interest and expertise of different scientists at the two universities, we find many more areas of possible potential synergy and integration and overlap between those two institutions. That's what you see on the right here. So where do we start if we want to promote collaboration between UF and FSU? First, we will have to find common intersecting topics of expertise that exist at both UF and FSU, on which both UF and FSU have significant number of active scientists. And then we will have to examine relationships of topic similarity or proximity between scientists and identify, for example, pairs of scientists at UF and FSU who are very similar in what they do in their topics of interest. The text data we used here are classical bibliographic data with titles, abstracts, authors, author affiliations for all UF and FSU publications in the last 2 years, about 20,000 publications, actually 21,000 publications and 9,000 authors. A document here is one author. Again, we use NLP in all the three areas that we mentioned today. This is a project that was conducted with support from the UF Clinical and Translational Science Institute. And this is a quick overall visualization of some of our findings. If you look on the left, you see a network of actual behavioral collaborations between UF authors in orange and FSU authors in purple or maroon. There are some sparse collaborations, mainly happening at the periphery of the main research thrusts that exist at UF. But the network on the right is what was produced by natural language processing. It's a network of topical overlaps or similarities and potential synergies between UF and FSU authors, which now allows us to identify common or intersecting topics, such as the 4 colored areas that you see on the right. And we actually found 16 common topics between UF and FSU. And we use these topics to inform an intervention to promote collaboration between UF and FSU and to incentivize UF and FSU scientists to submit a pilot proposal to the UF Clinical and Translational Science Institute. We're going to wrap it up today with some common frequently asked questions about NLP, particularly in the fields and disciplines represented in our college: linguistics, the humanities, the social sciences. One particular FAQ that I like to say just a couple of words about is, can I just do traditional text analysis? This is all good, all great, but really, I've already been doing this for years or decades with tools like NVivo or MaxQDA. So how do these algorithms compare with the standard text analysis that humanities scholars or social scientists have already been doing for a long time? And is the algorithm here going to make my text analysis useless and replace it? The quick answer is no. And you should rather think about NLP as what some have called cognitive prosthetics. These algorithms have the goal of enhancing traditional text analysis, augmenting it, but are never independent from it. There are a couple of examples here, but there are many more on how traditional human text analysis and NLP interact. Kevin already mentioned some of this. Supervised NLP can be trained on existing human analysis, for example, on text that was manually coded by humans in MaxQDA, to then reliably extend that same coding to much bigger data, to thousands of interviews or articles. Or datafication. Unsupervised NLP can turn large amounts of disorderly and structured text into structured data with topics, precise clusters, precise measures of similarity and association, which then a human researcher can meaningfully analyze. So we can think of a sort of human sandwich where human analysis is needed before NLP algorithms and after NLP algorithms run. Related to this, what's my role in an NLP project as a human researcher? We can quickly talk about this in the Q&A segment. There are different important roles to be played here. Does this apply to small or specialized data as well? Or do I necessarily have to work with big data to use NLP? What are some important limitations, biases, and pitfalls that I must be aware of when using NLP algorithms? And our last slide just shows you some useful online resources to get started with NLP, particularly in Python and R. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. There are a few questions already in the queue, so let me begin with the first one. When helping humans to be superhumans, this was from early in the presentation, Kevin, what could be those hidden patterns that are too complex for the human mind?
To answer your question, Tanya, I think a lot of the times we don't really know what the underlying data looks like in terms of the underlying structure of the data in many cases. And in the spiral shape example I gave you earlier, what we observe is we don't actually observe that spiral shape. We don't know that shape. That is the underlying structure, if you like. And sometimes the space can be as complex as spiral shape. And the underlying structure could easily be multidimensional. And to give a more concrete example, you can imagine that you have an observation that you see, you want to explain the observation, to predict the observation. There may be many, many, many factors that are behind it. And for social sciences, definitely, there's so much socio factors that we could never fully take into account. And in those cases, these factors can easily interact. There could be interaction between these factors. And if you were to look at each of the factors manually, you might not see any patterns at all, but you'll only be able to see some of them when you were to plot it in two-dimensional space. But if the pattern were underlying multi-dimensional, it's very hard to even visualize it. Hope that answers your question.
The next question is, what about learning inferences at the pragmatic level?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that means. If you're talking about like pragmatics as in linguistics, so inferences like implicatures, explicatures, and so on, yeah, one could use specific linguistic models that are empowered by NLP tools to try to quantify them. So it's doable, but I would say existing methods might have a hard time from doing them.
There's a question, what is the difference between mean by weighted sentiment average as opposed to average sentiment? I'm not sure you meant a distinction there, but you may have.
Yeah, Kimberly, yeah, so what I mean, yeah, so basically, if you just take a grand average, you're basically saying the sentiment everywhere is worth equally But it is easily, it could be the case that some words that have very vague sentiment and they don't really contribute much to the overall sentiment of that piece of text. And supervised method can benefit from that, right? You can have the sentiment value for all the words in the text, and you can ask a human to judge the sentiment of that piece of text or of that paragraph. You can train a supervised machine learning algorithm to learn which words tend to be more important in which context, for example. Hope that answers the question.
There's a question, can you recommend an introduction to LDA, latent Dirichlet allocation that's easy to understand?
I sent Anne just one reference, but yeah, you can expand on this, Kevin.
No, easy to understand. I mean, there are certainly tutorials that we can, there are a few tutorials that we can share on this topic, but yeah.
Yeah, we do have, in our lab, for example, we have used some introductory tutorials and online resources that are relatively non-technical, and if you email Kevin or myself, we can definitely share some links with you.
And I will point out this last slide is actually a set of resources, and I believe you might make this PowerPoint available to everybody, so they'll have this. There is a question, does UF offer a specific course about NLP, and is there a research group? I just would chime in. I think the research group is probably, the kernel of it is right here within this network science group. And I think your plan is to build off that. Is that correct?
Is it for me?
Either one of you.
Yeah, I would say like from the quick survey, I mean, we did a survey already, right? And there are 20% or maybe less of us that have used NLP. But in terms of whether we have specific research groups, I think that in different college and different departments, there might be one or two different people who use NLP or even research on NLP. I know that in computer science, there are individual works on the more technical side of NLP. And so the people do exist, but I don't think there's a coherent research group that focuses just on NLP. And hopefully with our group, we're hoping to build up on that. And I welcome anyone who would like to join us. And in terms of specific courses, I myself do a course on Introduction to Computational Linguistics, which touch on various NLP areas. And I believe some other colleges also, some other departments might also run courses on topics related to NLP.
There's a question to both the speakers and the deans. What would be the critical mass of NLP researchers that we need to make UF a leader in this field? Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question. As you just pointed out, Kevin and Raffaele, there are people around the university that are sort of interested in this topic and this approach. So we already do have some folks here that just simply aren't currently talking to each other. But I venture to say we need more. Would you agree?
Well, certainly it would be good to have that critical mass that produces, for example, a stable core of NLP courses, undergraduate and graduate courses that students can take, or like one of our participants mentioned, a coherent research center that has NLP as one of its main thrusts and techniques that people could go to. There are some models for this. The UF CTSI, for example, has service centers and labs that provide assistance with biostatistics, for example. So there could be a similar model applied for natural language processing in other institutes at UF.
Yeah, so these questions are coming from Aaron Broadwell in Anthropology, who wants a specific number. So I'm going to say 50. off the top of my head. There's a comment from a faculty member in computer science who says they've taught a senior level elective course on NLP and they're scheduled to teach it again in the spring. So again, there is this kind of expertise around campus. We're just not currently organized into a community, and I think that's a big goal. And then to Aaron's point, we would probably like to add to that community. That so far appear to be all the questions. Do you all have any follow-up? Do you want to comment briefly on this last slide here? How does somebody who knows nothing about this sort of pursue it? If somebody, for example, an anthropologist or a sociologist, political scientist, somebody with a lot of field notes wants to consider using NLP, how would they go about doing that?
I think that's maybe a Raffaele question.
So again, these are in the last slide, just a few pointers. There are a number of gentle introductions, and I think a good starting point would be to think about ways that NLP can complement or enhance your existing workflow and your existing type of analysis with things like NVivo or MaxQDA. For example, how you can, what I would think about is how you can replicate some of the manual coding that you do in MaxQDA with NLP code, with an NLP algorithm, which then you could reapply to much larger amounts of data. So the first step you may want to think about is ways in which NLP speeds up your existing work and makes it more efficient and removes the most manual and repetitive and time-consuming aspects of your existing work.
And I will just say that we do have a fair amount of expertise in this network science group, and I think most of you are willing to have a chat with some folks offline to help them. One last question that came in. Most of the text that you've been presenting as examples is literal prose style. Do you see any future of NLP in being able to analyze more vague or subjective writing like fiction or poetry?
Yeah, I'll give that a stab. So, so there are people out there doing digital humanities, and I believe even at UF. And from some of the work that I've seen is like, for example, they would analyze the entire sets of novels by Jane Austen, for example, or look at entire series of Harry Potter. And they do very interesting analysis. For example, they would look at the how the characters would interact across time, across chapters, and whether there are more appearance of certain characters here and there, as well as what kind of topics they would talk about under what themes. And I would say that applying NLP technologies to fictions and poetries is already, fiction definitely has been done. Poetry, there are some work on generating poetries by learning the metrical structure and the lexical items to be able to generate human-like level poetry. So that has been done. Whereas if you want to talk about the vagueness and subjectiveness of some of the analysis that you might want to conduct, that's a little bit harder because you need to be able to quantify that further before you can apply, before you can interpret your results from using NLP tools.
Well, one more came in. How about using NLP to do systematic reviews for like a systematic literature review?
Well, yeah, that's certainly a possible application. And I think to some degree, it's something that's already, that people already do with some of the existing systematic review software. So obviously some of the typical goals of NLP analysis are things that we do all the time with systematic reviews and meta-analysis, identifying recurrent keywords, attaching a measure of association between to each article, between that article and each keyword. So that's certainly an application that does exist, and that's probably already incorporated in some of the systematic review software that's around.
I would say that you can also apply text summarization tools, and the topic modeling technique that we introduced can aid systematic reviews. You can process thousands of papers and look at what kind of thing they talk about, and to see if some papers, maybe there's a bimodal distribution. Some people have focused on one angle, the other people focus on another angle. So you can certainly use it to help you conduct systematic reviews.
Okay, we're slightly over. I want to thank both of you for that was an excellent presentation, and thank everybody for participating. If you've got questions, please send them offline to Kevin, Raphael, myself. We'll be happy to try and answer them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.